Join me and my guest for a conversation where we discuss the monster-first approach.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Thank you so much for joining me on this eve of a new year. We're all starting a new adventure, I hope, in 2021. Let's just jump into the interview. My guest today is the host of the Making a Monster podcast, and he is also a writer who has published on the DM's Guild, Lucas Zellers. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
How were you first introduced to tabletop RPGs?
Oh, man. There's some fact-checking that I need to do about this story, but the very first memory I have of tabletop RPGs is of finding a source book that my dad had in his library, and then I guess forgot about. I discovered it when we were moving some things around. I remember this distinctly, grabbing that monster manual and flipping through it and finding just those old splodgy first or second edition illustrations, and the one that tugged on my imagination the most was a displacer beast. And I had no idea what any of the numbers meant, but I was just flipping through this thing and looking at these pictures of monsters that I had never seen before, and had an entirely different sense of humor and purpose. So that's where I first discovered it. But I didn't start playing until I think what you might call this sort of second generation or new wave of players that came in around 4th and 5th edition. Mm-hmm. So the first time I played D&D was in December of 2015. And I remember that date because I remember having a conversation with someone not too long before that where I said, I'm a nerd. Like, I watch Doctor Who and everything. But at least I don't play D&D. Like, that's a bridge too far.
What?
And, you learn a lot in 5 years.
Yeah. So you weren't that much of a nerd, but now it kind of seems you are.
I've embraced it. There's no going back.
Yeah, well, I know. I am apparently a bit older than you because I played for the first time in 1982, and I haven't looked back since then. But wow, so you played for the first time in 2015.
That's right.
And then now, as I mentioned, you're writing Dungeons & Dragons content. You're creating a podcast with D&D content. What caught your imagination about it?
Woof. A lot of things. I think I was always looking for D&D. There's a lot of different things that drew me to the game, or that kept me playing over and over again. It scratched an itch that I have. If I were to put it in terms that don't make me sound just like a total starstruck kid, I don't think there's any creative pursuit that doesn't have its expressions somewhere in Dungeons and Dragons. And I've done a lot of things. I'm kind of a serial creative. I was doing community theater for a while. I was a musician for a while. I played at voice acting. I did visual arts, graphic design, a lot of different things. And all of those things are at home somewhere in Dungeons and Dragons. And to be honest, it's been one of the most fulfilling ways to experience that. There's something that I get from being together with people and building a story together, discovering that people understand the story that we're trying to tell together, and doing things that match up even without us laying out a screenplay beforehand. There's that magical moment where a character at the table or player at the table will do something and you go, oh, of course, that's a total fighter move. And when you can begin to predict the actions and the behaviors of the characters around you at the table, then you know them like people. And there's just an undefinable magic to that keeps me coming back.
There is something about Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games. It's just to me, it is a wholly unique art form that kind of what appeared in Wisconsin in 1974 or whatever. And it just kind of blows my mind. That is interesting that you say that it pulls in all of the kind of different art forms.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to love it. Some people play the game just because they like to improvise, or they like to play different characters. Some people play the game because they like to paint miniatures.
Yep.
Some people play the game because they're huge math nerds and they like war games. And some people like to draw the characters or the comics or the moments.
Yeah.
And all of those people are right at home doing the same thing, which is great.
Yeah. And then other people like stuff. So they like keeping track of items and things and equipment.
Yeah, there's a loot goblin in every party.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I did like what you said there, kind of like the kind of the randomness or the kind of the magic that can happen at the table, because I had done in a almost another lifetime, I had done some independent filmmaking, and I would have my scenes written out and I would shoot them with my actors. But some of the best things that came about were the things that happened just because the location had to be a certain way, or I had to put the camera in a certain place because of, space constraints, or there was an interesting thing sitting there and I told the actor to pick it up, or something like that. And there's just kind of a magic in that improvisational kind of, kind of moment. And I think that is something that happens in tabletop role-playing games like every session, and which kind of keeps me coming back to them as well.
Yeah, it's the magic of live theater. We do it once and it will never be the same again. And it's totally a product of the time and place in which we made it.
Yeah, absolutely. So now when you started playing, did you start running games pretty quickly, or did you play for a while?
I played for a while when I started. This was back in 4th edition when you needed an Excel sheet to do all the math still. I tell you what, I don't miss saves versus fortitude and reflex. But when 5th edition came out and I discovered the DMs Guild, I think 2016, 2017, that's when I started to run the games. I always ended up as kind of the guy who would step up and run a session that wasn't part of the long running campaign. So I still don't have, I have one that I run with my family, but I'm rarely the guy who has like 3 or 4 things that we do every week and have been for years. But I'm always the guy who says, yes, well, I have 3 or 4 one-shots that we could run at the drop of a hat. And I love doing that. I love being the place where people try the ideas that they don't get to or don't want to do in a long-running campaign. The things where people take risks. And that's my experience as a DM, is kind of the alternate.
Okay. No, that's cool. The first time I was the dungeon master was the day after I played for the first time. I ran my mom through a dungeon. Of course, I was 9 years old, but so that's when it started for me, and I just could not stop.
Yeah, you've told this story on the podcast before, and I remember thinking, you have the coolest mom.
Yeah, she's pretty cool, I have to say. She's pretty cool. She always humored us. That's certainly true.
That is a big leap of faith. Like your 9-year-old son is, let's play D&D, and you're like, yes, absolutely. Run this game for me. I will trust you to adjudicate the rules.
Oh, well, she had no idea what I was doing, and neither did I. Right? Like I didn't know really any of the rules or anything. I was just really making special. Up stuff. Yeah. I was just making up stuff. So she probably doesn't even remember. I'll have to ask her if she remembers.
You should.
Yeah. I don't know. She might not. But anyway. She was like, "Oh yeah, that one time, like she just like all those times you forced me to play all those games when nobody else would play with you or something like that." Yeah, but anyway, so hopefully I haven't told the story too many times on the podcast. But
I think I just got it the once.
yeah, everybody's got to hear it. Yeah, and I just kind of I like to tell it because I think some people that something that always frustrated me, kind of growing up playing Dungeons and Dragons, was that I would introduce somebody to the game, or they would say I would meet somebody and they would say they had played before, and then I would be like, "Cool, do you want to run something?" Me and a couple buddies, we could play with you or whatever. And they're like, no, I can't run a session right now. I need more experience like playing. And I would always just pull it out, like I ran my first game the day after I played the first time. Like anybody can run a game, like, right. Like it doesn't matter. Like anybody can.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, it probably comes from my bitterness then of after once you do it one time, I had to run most of the games throughout my life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The forever DM syndrome is real. You got to watch out for it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, since you've run mainly one-shots in that, do you have any advice for somebody who's going to run a one-shot?
Oh, I have loads of signature DM advice. This may be a bit of a bigger question, but for running one shot specifically, the biggest thing that I can tell dungeon masters or game masters, or if, by the way, you're playing Monster of the Week, you have the coolest title ever. You're the Keeper of Monsters and Mysteries, which... Can I make that my job title, please? And get it on a brass plaque on my desk?
Yeah.
Oh, now I'm reusing jokes. Anyway, for a one-shot, the biggest thing you have got to think about is time management. You will not get through as much as you hope. That's just how it is. So D&D is pretty predictable in this regard. And maybe that's just because it's the system I have the most familiarity with. But D&D is a nesting doll. Inside your campaign is a story arc, and inside of that is a session, and inside of that is an encounter, and it builds backward from there. So a campaign might have 3 or 4 story arcs. Every story arc is maybe an ungodly number of sessions. And each session, you learn this if you're running one-shots, each session has a limited number of encounters that you can do. And a single encounter in Dungeons & Dragons is either combat or... it's one of the 3 pillars, either combat, exploration, or social. And each encounter is going to take 30 to 45 minutes. So if you have 4 hours to play, you can do 6 to 8 things. Pick your 6 to 8 wisely. And don't be surprised if you don't get to the other 2 that you were really hoping you could squeeze in.
Yeah. I think, one-shots are always time management, and I think I got to learn it in low pressure settings with my friends who were like 12 years old and stuff at the time, but
when we all had 8 hours to give.
Oh gosh, yeah. Oh yeah. Or I would have probably spent 20 thinking about 20 hours thinking about it through the week and all kinds of stuff at that time of my life. But you always want to start close to something cool too, right? Like you always want to try to have something definitely cool that's going to happen instead of, let's take 2 hours of you all meeting and learning to trust each other or something like that. It's like, no, we cut all that out.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to give people something to start with. And that's a good point, too. Your first encounter is going to take a little bit longer compared to your last encounter, just because your players are moving more slowly. They're not comfortable yet. Yeah. So something else to keep in mind.
I'm just thinking, too, you had mentioned Monster of the Week. Have you branched out into other role-playing games as well?
A couple, not nearly as many as I would like. I ran my first Monster of the Week session a couple of weeks ago. There's actually a couple of the systems that I've featured on my podcast have been the ones that have been really meaningful to me outside of Dungeons and Dragons. Monster of the Week, because it's so far removed from the roll to hit, roll for damage, and kind of the war game heritage of Dungeons and Dragons, and being so narratively focused.
Mhm.
There was one that I played that I didn't run, called Starship Infernum, and I was very grateful to have that designer on my show as well. And that's a blackjack based game, which is a whole different experience versus deciding what happens 6 seconds at a time. So I haven't run a lot of things other than Dungeons and Dragons, but every time I have gotten outside of that system, I have found something really meaningful that I've really enjoyed, or that helps me look at that experience of playing the game and of doing collective storytelling in a new and different way.
No, that's interesting, and those are a couple games that I have not yet to play, and I am always trying to branch out, but it does kind of always come back to Dungeons and Dragons, though, because it is so cool.
And I don't begrudge Dungeons and Dragons its place in the world, right? Like it's high fantasy and high magic is very accessible for players, especially now that we have Lord of the Rings in the canon of great cinema history. Yeah. And also that high magic system where you can just sort of wave your hand and say, a wizard did it. It's very kind to game masters and to writers and to players. You know, you don't have to bother sorting out whether that matches physics or cyberpunk, or is that really steampunk or noir? Like, we don't care. A wizard did it. Let's move on. So yeah, it's earned its place, and it belongs where it is because it's so easy to write for that. But, you know, play Dungeons and Dragons because it's probably the first one you've heard about. Play other systems for the stories D&D can't tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good advice. Now, when you run a one shot, do you plan it all out ahead of time?
Yes.
Okay.
And I've run one shots where I planned it very thoroughly, and I had to chuck almost everything I planned. I've run one shots on the opposite end of that spectrum where I planned almost nothing, expecting for it to just happen, and then I was scrambling. But you know, you've done a lot of work for the No Prep GM. One of the thing that broke me into the DMs Guild was a one shot that I wrote called The Contract. And I wrote that to have the same story beats every time you play it. But what happened at each of those story beats is determined by a random die roll. So you're given, in brief, you're given a contract to protect the heir of a very large, very influential family. And something you know is coming to kill that heir tonight, but you don't know when it is going to show up, what it is, who hired it, or why it's there. And there's always a plot twist in that as well. So there's more than 1,000 different ways to run the same one shot. And I've run probably about a dozen of them myself. So I kind of hacked the system, the no prep game master system, by just running the same game every time and making it a little bit different.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, because as you mentioned, yes, I do the no prep kind of method usually. And I know that takes a lot of experience, right? Since I've been playing since I was 9, and I give away my age all the time on the show, but I still am loath to say that, you know, I'm closing in on what, like, you know, maybe 30, maybe I'm closer to 40 years playing role-playing games than I am to 30 years playing role-playing games. And so I find it fascinating when people tell me that they plan everything out. And I was looking at your adventure, The Contract, and kind of wondering. Yeah, I haven't got to check it out too much just yet, but because I was definitely wondering how how you did that with, allowing for kind of the same structure, but different things to happen at the same time.
That's the secret.
Yeah.
It's the same story beats, just the details are different.
Yeah. No, that is an interesting way to take it. Cause as you mentioned, my method is, of course, think about some things and then sit down at the table, listen to what your players tell you, and then kind of just go from there. That kind of brings us into, you talk about something on your podcast as well. You talk about the monster first kind of concept. What do you mean by that? The monster first?
Yeah, so monster first storytelling is a name that evolved out of my experience talking to game masters. And actually, I'll tell you where it first started before I even had the podcast as a project and an idea. I was reading the Monster Manual because that was my portal to Dungeons and Dragons, was the Monster Manual.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started running 5th edition games and figuring out how to put those together, I noticed that you could plan for and run entire games out of the Monster Manual with nothing else. So it gives you maybe a page of lore, it'll give you regional effects, it'll give you actions and abilities and unique weaknesses and resistances that each of those monsters has. And each of those things is telling you something about the monster and the story that it belongs in and the experience that you're gonna have when you encounter it. So it was a real revelation to me to realize I could junk everything. I could spend 4 hours. I could do 6 to 8 encounters with nothing but the 2 pages in the Monster Manual on the Sphinx, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so that got me thinking about why. Like, why is first of all, why is the Monster Manual such a hallmark of role-playing games and D&D in particular? Why is it such a feature of other games that they don't have a monster manual and they're very sort of hipster proud of that? And then why is it that you can define entire encounters based on the monsters that are in them? And I have a lot of I've thought about it a lot obviously since I started the podcast, and here's what it comes down to. I'm about to start on probably a longer explanation than this might need, but here we go. So the heart of storytelling is conflict, right? When I was in college, I competed with a speech and debate team, which is like the band kids, but less cool. And one of the things that debate taught me was that if we agree, the debate's over. We've done it. Congratulations. You've won at debate. We have arrived at the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a real revelation to me that if we, there's no point to doing what we're doing unless we disagree. And the same way for storytelling, they begin with once upon a time. And once we get to happily ever after, story's over. Which, by the way, doesn't seem fair to me. And that's a whole nother soapbox that I don't have the space to get on. So storytelling runs on conflict. And in the space of tabletop role-playing games, that conflict is defined and personified by monsters. Joseph Campbell refers to the crossing of the first threshold in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I swore that I wouldn't be one of those guys who quotes the hero's journey all the time, but here we are. The main defining metric of the way he puts together a story is the difference between the known world and the unknown world. And what do we put on maps of the unknown world when we don't know what's there?
Here be dragons.
Here be dragons. Here be monsters. Because the monsters are the unknown. They're the thing that we don't understand, the thing that we fear. So monsters, being at the heart of storytelling, they represent our attitudes about the unknown, the other, what we fear, what we don't understand, and what we shame, which the function of shame in culture has changed over time. And it's really interesting to me the ways in which we used to use it and don't use it anymore. So I think when I talk about monster first storytelling, what I'm really telling you is that there really isn't a story without a monster in it of some kind. And the monsters always mean something. They're saying something. They're automatically assigning some characteristic to the unknown and the other and the thing to be feared. So that's what I mean by monster first storytelling. And that's why I wanted to make a podcast about it. Because in looking at storytelling at such an essential elemental level, I was able to bypass the half an hour of context that every D&D player wants to give you about their story or their setting and whatnot. I'm like, just tell me about the monster. We've got 15 minutes. And nobody so far has not been able to come to something meaningful within the space of about 15 minutes just by talking about their monster.
It is interesting. I know because I usually tend to, especially when I'm running kind of a no prep game, and when I talk about the no prep game master, of course, I'm talking about, as you probably know, I'm talking about people who have jobs, who have families, who have, all kinds of commitments, and they have 3 hours once a week that they've carved out of their huge, busy schedule to play, Dungeons and Dragons with their friends. And, I know for me, especially, it was like, I don't have another 3 hours, in the week, to plan something, and I'm lucky sometimes if I get, 5 minutes before the session starts, right? If I can think a little bit. So I use my time when I'm driving or in the shower or something like that, thinking about, what possibly I will run or something like that. And so in that approach, sometimes the monster to me is inconsequential, right? Like I rely on what my players are doing, what their characters are, what their characters' backstories are. And, I'm not talking about the 19-page backstories. I'm just talking about hooks, that's a whole different story too. But, I'm talking about a few hooks that they've given me about their past that I can build something on, or something that that is a trick, I guess, in some way. But if I watch a movie or if I read a good book, I will take a situation out of that book or movie and out of context and generalize. People don't know what that is, and they will think they think, wow, where did you think of this? And I'm like, well, actually, it was in this book I read. And then they're all cool with it, because I don't run the book or whatever necessarily. Although I do talk about that in my book. You can do that if your players haven't seen the movie or read the book. You can just run the whole book, and it gives you an adventure right there.
You take all your influences and you remix them. Austin Kleon talks about this in Steal Like an Artist. Which is, I think, at the heart of what your podcast is doing. And if your listeners haven't read that book, it's very small and very quick, and it will help you do what you do.
Yeah. But then you were saying, like the kind of the monster first approach, because you can see, certainly in some great literature and some film, where if you start with the monster, you can see how the story can kind of just unfold around that monster. And I'm thinking of, say Frankenstein or Dracula or, maybe even Jaws, right? You have the monster in place, and then your story kind of unfolds around it. So I think it is kind of an interesting take on that. 'Cause I know, like I said, sometimes I get, I get to a point in my story and I'm like, okay, they need to fight something. What are they going to fight? And I just kind of, pull out something, or, I've been relying on clues through other sessions to then have my big kind of monster or villain kind of emerge from the story, because I'm just letting all of those things kind of happen, and it keeps me from kind of ramming my players down the railroad, as it were, when I keep things open-ended like that. But I do see, what you're talking about here, and it does make perfect sense, because I have done that before in the past too, and I didn't really have a name for it, right? Like I just flip open the monster manual or something like that, and just looking through and go, okay, how do I get the Kraken? How do I get my players and my characters to interact with the Kraken, right?
Right.
And so I have done that before, and and kind of putting the name to it. I thought that was really, interesting.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And it's an approach that is made possible by games with a monster manual, but it also exists in games that don't have it. I was talking to Michael Sands. This is going to date the podcast or the recording. Just released an episode with Michael Sands, who wrote Monster of the Week, and he does the same thing, but his game very deliberately doesn't have a monster manual. So he's always thinking about, what have the players done? You play to find out what happens. We're going to put a monster in there that matches the genre and the themes and the topics that they're trying to play with. But everything in Monster of the Week, even the places you go to, have their own motivation. And it's explicit. It's stated, like some monsters want to devour, some monsters want to reproduce, some monsters want to hoard, to take, to have, to collect. And that, it's the same kind of thing. It's the same monster first storytelling. It just doesn't rely on a monster manual to do it. Yeah. But a lot of those classic monsters, werewolf, Dracula, Frankenstein, by now we're literate enough as a culture to be able to easily understand what those monsters are telling us. So a werewolf crosses the line between man and beast, a line that you think should be distinct and recognizable, and it's not. Same for vampires, between dead and undead. Between dead and alive, rather. And for Frankenstein, it's between creator and creation. And there's a lot of really interesting ethics that are bound up in those monsters. Like, why do we, is there an animal inside us all? Is society just a veneer? Is it who we actually are? And that's a question we can ask that has a bunch of different answers. If you have a vampire in your story, and they're specifically there to steal people's blood, and that deals with issues of purity and innocence. And there's a lot of great writing that's been done on that I'm really not qualified to discuss, but those issues are there, and the more you understand them, the more you're able to give your players a monster that satisfies what they're really looking for. If I just throw a demon in a story that has nothing to do with good and evil as separate, distinct forces in the world, if so far your players have been treating the world as mechanistic and a machine that responds to its inputs, and suddenly there's an angel in it, that's not going to be satisfying. So monster first storytelling, in the way that I use it and the way that I try to enable on my podcast, is giving people the right monster for the right question.
No, and I definitely like the idea. And of course, you were talking about the RPG called Monster of the Week. Of course, we have TV shows that are called Monster of the Weeks, right? Like, and they are solely our heroes reacting to a new monster each and every week, right?
And that genre, I mean, you know this as well as I do. That genre is sort of a product of production demands. We can do we got 20 episodes to put out, and what are we going to do? So what's the makeup department got in the back?
Yeah.
But yeah, Monster of the Week is a product of genre fiction, and it gains its name from that genre. So it's designed to do one thing, and it does it very, very well. But only if you're literate in the genre that it's based on.
Yeah.
Your Buffys and your Supernaturals and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Even Star Trek, almost
at times.
Almost. Yeah. But it is, and I know you mentioned there are some practical concerns why you introduce something like that. But, the X-Files was one, obviously.
Yep.
But,
and there is a more 90s show in the world than X-Files.
No kidding. But it is interesting that there is not only do storytellers tell those stories over and over again, that people want to consume them over and over again. And that is a very popular type of entertainment. Because you can say, bring it up to date with the Marvel movies. What are they doing? They're fighting a monster each time, right?
Yep. Age of Ultron. Okay.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. And
and Marvel has its big gray villain problem, where the villain is just a big gray version of the hero.
Yeah.
And that too is interesting to me. Maybe we could do an apocalypse world system called Big Gray Villain, where we just oh, there's some legs on that. I gotta write that down.
Okay. Maybe there is something to that. This is a huge question. So you can answer it in just like 30 seconds, I'm sure.
All right. Sure. Set me up like that.
Yeah. Why are we so fascinated with monsters? Like as humans, why do we do that all the time? Why do we want to see a new monster each week? Is it too big?
No, I can do this. I'm just trying to figure out how to cite my source on this. I don't think I wrote the name down. Give me a second.
I've asked a couple people this. I asked the Monster Professor this, and I asked Philip Athens, New York Times bestselling author, this same question. And
well, I'm glad you brought up the Monster Professor. I'm cribbing some of my ideas here from him, or at least the ones that he brought up. Yeah. Okay, so Josh Woods, the Monster Professor, did an episode on his show where he talked about monster definition and horror theory. He mentioned a guy by the name of Richard Handler, who said that there are only two stories that have ever been told. The Voyage of Discovery and A Stranger Comes to Town. In The Voyage of Discovery, you go out to the monsters. You go out to where there be dragons, and you come back with a power you've earned from the unknown world. In A Stranger Comes to Town, the monster comes to you, and what you thought was safe and clear and understandable isn't that way anymore. And that's where a lot of horror lands, is in A Stranger Comes to Town. I think we want monsters because we use them to help us understand things. Here's something else I've noticed that tabletop RPGs have taught me. Monsters don't level up. You do. Heroes do. People do. And I think that's because we understand this. I'm a different person on Monday morning than I am on Friday nights. Everybody is. I'm a different person now than I was 10 years ago. And the more decades you live through, the more you get used to that phenomenon. People change, people grow, and people are different than they were the last time you met them. And that's the nature of being human. We make monsters because they're static. They're a point of reference. They're a bucket that we can put all of these anxieties or confusions in, and we say, and we use them to help us understand things. It's been pointed out rather brilliantly that the kids in Stranger Things, a great Netflix show that brought Dungeons and Dragons to a whole other level of mainstream. The kids used the language of Dungeons and Dragons to succeed where adults failed because they didn't have a way of understanding what was happening. So we make a monster and we call it a monster so that we can understand things that we don't, or that we can so that we can interact with things that are difficult or hard to explain. Maybe the best example of this, maybe not the best example, but my favorite example of this is Godzilla. When I was a kid, I wanted a guy in a rubber suit to come and wreck a cardboard town, and that was enough for me. I was happy with that. And I remember the moment very specifically when I found out that in America, radiation made the Hulk. It made superheroes. Mm-hmm. And in Japan, radiation made Godzilla. It made a disaster. Yeah. It's funny. It's almost like we have totally different attitudes toward nuclear power and what it does to us.
Well, if you've had a nuclear bomb dropped in your country, you probably do think about radiation quite a bit more.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't an empowering story for them. It was a story of catharsis. Mm-hmm. And that's I think, why we make monsters. Yeah. Because they help us say things that we couldn't say any other way. Feel mm-hmm. things that we couldn't feel, that weren't safe before, and understand things that we couldn't understand.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is an interesting point when you said that, monsters don't level up, right? Because we level up after we confront the monster, right? And
yep. I think the door, you kill the monster, you get its loot, and you get XP, and that's the rhythm that we're used to.
But I think a classic example, is Odysseus and the sirens, right? He's going to listen to the sirens, but he's going to be tied to the mast, and then when he passes through, right, he has leveled up because he has heard the siren song, and since he was tied to the mast, he didn't wander off and into the torment they were actually had in store for unsuspecting sailors.
Yeah, it's a perfect example.
Yeah,
kind of a surprising one that I heard from Polygon recently is Bruce Lee. In a lot of his movies, you can watch him learn and adapt to the fighting techniques that are being used against him. Mm-hmm. So he'll answer back to one of the movies that he was famous for. I think it was Game of Death. Is he just works his way up a tower, and on each level is a new and more dangerous martial artist until we get to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and you get a footprint from your shoulder to your hip bone. Like that's a great setup. But in each of those fights, he starts to do things that the people he's fighting are doing. That's mm-hmm. what a hero does. He levels up. He changes. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar didn't change in that fight. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar lost. Except not really, because he became a massively successful person and an NBA Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
Shout out to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar if you're listening. I guess I don't know.
A podcast first,
yeah.
but at least we're talking about Game of Death and Bruce Lee, because it's awesome. But I think that is, this is totally random, but you bringing that up, that is often kind of a mainstay in martial art movies, right? That the martial artist, following kind of a tried and possibly now worn out formula, right? He faces the bad guy. Well, he gets beaten the first time, right? Mm-hmm. And then he's got to go off and he's got to learn this new technique or this secret technique that hasn't been taught before. We see that in everything from, Jackie Chan's The Drunken Master to Bruce Lee's movies, just kind of on down the line.
The Kickboxer is another example.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Kickboxer, because he loses the first time and then he has to figure out.
And he comes back.
Yep.
And for some reason, nobody else in the Game of Death or whatever has been doing their homework. This is why monsters are fascinating to me. They're this weird anachronism. Yeah. Monster's not doing bench presses. Why not? No, because he's a monster. We need him to say this thing and mean this thing. And if he changes, he's not useful anymore.
Yeah,
he's a person, not a monster.
Yeah, he's already at the pinnacle of monsterness, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
yeah. Although, now that we've been talking about it, I don't know. I think about things on the podcast that I am certainly, I am a non-academic who's read just enough to make himself dangerous. And because thinking about, say, Frankenstein, who is in the novel at least, is a pretty dang close to being a fully realized person, but still gets rejected and treated as a monster, even though he didn't have to be one. Which is probably why we're still fascinated with that story, like 202 years later from when it was written. Because
and there's a D&D tie-in there too. I'm not the first person to say this, but I absolutely love it. Intelligence is knowing that Frankenstein is not the monster.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom is knowing that Frankenstein is the monster.
Okay. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So intelligence then would be sort of the dry book knowledge that Frankenstein is the name of the doctor in the story, not the name of the monster. In fact, the monster I don't think gets a name.
No.
He might be... the story ran under a title, I think, The Modern Prometheus.
Yeah.
Also something that a high intelligence character in D&D would know.
Yeah.
If that character also had low wisdom, they might have missed the point.
Yeah.
A point made brilliantly by the National Theater Company, who cast the roles of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster to switch every other night. Like the same actor would be playing both Frankenstein and the monster, and you wouldn't know which version you were going to. Part of Mary Shelley's point is that at some point in this story, it becomes hard to tell who's the man and who is the monster here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, that's what I said. Probably why we're still fascinated with that story is because it is operating on a number of levels, and it is complex to say the least. Really pulling out a lot of things there, and seeing
it's useful.
Yeah. Yeah, because the monster only became a monster when his creator rejected him. Because the only time the creature commits murder is when he faces rejection, and he faced rejection the first time when he saw his creator. Interesting. But anyway, fascinating.
Yeah, it's a deep well.
It is a deep well. I know, we can keep going. I actually, in a previous episode, the Monster Professor and I discussed Frankenstein probably for about 20 minutes or more of that episode, and we didn't get there. And I'm still fascinated by the character because it is amazing. Well, now, I've had you on here a long time, Lucas, but just really quick, you mentioned the contract, but you've published some other things on the DM's Guild, correct?
A very small handful of other things, a couple of ill-fated paper miniatures, and one other replayable adventure that I based on the Town Musicians of Bremen, which is a classic German fairy tale that's more of a comedy and a lark than I think I made it out to be. But yeah. So there's a couple of things from me on the DM's Guild, and more I'm certain will be out there by December.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Now, where can people find your podcast so they can check out Making a Monster?
Ooh, I love this question. So the best place to find me on the web is at scintilla.studio. That's SCINTILLA.studio. And that's the blog that I started back in 2016 to look at creative pursuits through the language of ecology, helping people grow their projects by treating it as a habitat to be created and preserved, an ecosystem to be fed. To find the podcast, which is kind of the current project, or as we've talked about, the one that encompasses all others. It's scintilla.studio/monster. All of the transcripts are there, some articles, and a bunch of extras that the designers have been gracious enough to give me. So sometimes you can get stat blocks for the monster that we talk about. Sometimes you can get some extra background. I've got some short fiction that I've been given. A lot of artwork that people have been generous enough to share. So scintilla.studio/monster, or literally wherever you get podcasts.
All right. Well, I will be sure and link up your website and the podcast in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anyone who is listening to this show can just hop over to dicegeeks.com and they will see links for the podcast, as well as I will link up the contract and a few of your other adventures, as long as I find them there on the DMs Guild.
Yeah.
Now, Lucas, thank you for coming on the show. I know we had kind of a wide-ranging conversation about monsters and that. I had a ton of fun. Just thank you so much for being on the show today.
Matt, thank you for having me. Like I said, I am in great company among the guests on your show. It has been an honor and a privilege.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Lucas today. If you want to learn more about him and his monster first approach, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, where you can listen to his podcast, as well as check out his website and the adventures that he has published. If you want something for free, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show, and you will be up to date on what is happening here at Dice Geeks, because every Friday I send out an email update. Now, if you enjoy these episodes, I would really appreciate it if you could support the show in some way. You can tell a friend about it. You can share it on social media. You can rate, review, or subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. You can also support the show financially on Patreon. If you just head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks, you can learn about that there. Now, guys, I thank you so much for listening. And as I mentioned at the top, I hope everybody has a great new year. And probably like everybody, here's to hoping that 2021 is a lot better than 2020. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.